The Paranoid Style in American Politics, unabridged version by Richard Hofstadter, read by Fiveum. This essay is a revised and expanded version of the Herbert Spencer lecture delivered at Oxford on November 1963. An abridged text appeared in Harper's Magazine in November of 1964. Since this essay is older, should the author reference something that would have been common sense to a 1964 reader, but be less common sense to the average listener, I will use the following sound effect to signify the beginning and the end of a break in the essay itself to give a brief explanation. Although American political life has rarely been touched by the most acute varieties of class conflict, it has served again and again as an arena for uncommonly angry minds. Today, this fact is most evident on the extreme right wing, which has shown, particularly in the Goldwater movement. Hello, this is a reference to Barry Goldwater, who was Lyndon Johnson's Republican opponent in the 1964 presidential election. Barry Goldwater managed to beat out the so-called Eastern establishment, which consisted of the moderates and liberals who at the time dominated the levers of power within the Republican Party. Barry Goldwater was an unabashed conservative, and he got famously trounced in the 1964 United States presidential election. Goldwater's supporters were infamous for being prone to conspiracism, and many popular political commentators at the time, as well as the American general public, excluding fans of Goldwater, of course, were wondering what was it about Goldwater that caused him to bring so many conspiracies. And the main purpose of this essay by Richard Hofstadter is to say that honestly, it's really nothing new. How much political leverage can be got out of the animosities and passions of a small minority? Behind such movements, there is a style of mind, not always right-wing in its affiliations, that has a long and varied history. I call it the paranoid style, simply because no other word adequately evokes the qualities of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy that I have in mind. In using the expression paranoid style, I'm not speaking in a clinical sense, but borrowing a clinical term for other purposes. I have neither the competence nor the desire to classify any figures of the past or present as certifiable lunatics. In fact, the idea of the paranoid style would have little contemporary relevance or historical value if it were applied only to people with profoundly disturbed minds. It is the use of paranoid modes of expression by more or less normal people that makes the phenomenon significant. When I speak of the paranoid style, I use the term much as a historian of art might speak of the Baroque or the Mannerist style. It is, above all, a way of seeing the world and of expressing oneself. Webster defines paranoia, the clinical entity, as a chronic mental disorder characterized by systemized delusions of persecution and one's own greatness. In the paranoid style, as I conceive it, the feeling of persecution is central, and it is indeed systematized in grandiose theories of conspiracy. But there is a vital difference between the paranoid spokesman in politics and the clinical paranoiac. Although they both tend to be overheated, over-suspicious, over-aggressive, grandiose, and apocalyptic in expression, the clinical paranoid sees the hostile and conspiratorial world in which he feels himself to be living as directed, specifically against him, whereas the spokesman of the paranoid style finds it directed against a nation, a culture, a way of life, whose fate affects not himself alone but millions of others, insofar as he does not usually see himself singled out as the individual victim of a personal conspiracy. He is somewhat more rational and much more disinterested. His sense that his political passions are unselfish and patriotic, in fact, goes far to intensify his feelings of righteousness and his moral indignation. Of course, the term paranoid style is pejorative, and it is meant to be. The paranoid style has a greater affinity for bad causes than good, but nothing entirely prevents a sound program or a sound issue from being advocated in the paranoid style, and it is admittedly impossible to settle the merits of an argument because we think we hear in its presentation the characteristic paranoid accents. Style has to do with the way in which ideas are believed and advocated, rather than with the truth or falsity of their content. A few simple and relatively non-controversial examples may make this distinction wholly clear. Shortly after the assassination of President Kennedy, a great deal of publicity was given to a bill sponsored chiefly by Senator Thomas E. Dodd of Connecticut to tighten federal controls over the sale of firearms through the mail. When hearings were being held on the measure, 3 men drove 2,500 miles to Washington from Baghdad, Arizona, to testify against it. Now there were arguments against the Dodd bill which, however unpersuasive one may find them, have the color of conventional political reasoning. But one of the Arizonians opposed it with what might be considered representative paranoid arguments, insisting that it was a further attempt by a subversive power to make us part of one world socialist government, and that it threatened to create chaos that would help our enemies to seize power. Again, it is common knowledge that the movement against the fluoridation of municipal water supplies has been catnip for cranks of all kinds, especially for those who have obsessive fear of poisoning. It is conceivable that at some time scientists may turn up conclusive evidence that this practice is, on balance, harmful, and such a discovery would prove the anti-fluoridationists quite right on the substance of their position. But it could hardly, at the same time, validate the contentions of those among them who, in characteristic paranoid fashion, have charged that fluoridation was an attempt to advance socialism under the guise of public health, or to rot out the brains of the community by introducing chemicals in the water supply in order to make the people more vulnerable to socialist or communist schemes. A distorted style is then a possible signal that may alert us to a distorted judgment, just as in art an ugly style is cue to fundamental defects of taste. What interests me here is the possibility of using political rhetoric to get at political pathology. One of the most impressive facts about the paranoid style in this connection is that it represents an old and recurrent mode of expression in our public life, which has frequently been linked with movements of suspicious discontent, and whose content remains much the same even when it is adopted by men of distinctly different purposes. Our experience suggests, too, that while it comes in waves of different intensity, it appears to be all but ineradicable. I choose American history to illustrate the paranoid style only because I happen to be an Americanist, and it is for me a choice of convenience. But the phenomenon is no more limited to American experience than it is to our contemporaries. Notions about an all-embracing conspiracy on the part of Jesuits or Freemasons or international capitalists, international Jews, or communists are familiar phenomena in many countries throughout modern history. One need only think of the response to President Kennedy's assassination in Europe to be reminded that Americans have no monopoly of the gift for paranoid improvisation. There is a footnote here which reads, Conspiratorial explanations of Kennedy's assassination have a far wider currency in Europe than they do in the United States. Man, that is like peak 1964. It's like almost naively optimistic in a sense. But no European, to my knowledge, has matched the ingenuity of Professor Revillo P. Oliver of the University of Illinois, who suggests that while Kennedy had performed many services for the communist conspiracy, he was falling behind in a schedule for the effective capture of the United States in 1963, and was rapidly becoming a political liability. He therefore had to be shot. Cited from the New York Times. More important The single case in modern history which one might say that the paranoid style has had a consummatory triumph occurred not in the United States but in Germany. It is a common ingredient of fascism and of frustrated nationalisms, though it appeals to many who are hardly fascists, and it can frequently be seen in the left-wing press. The famous Stalin Purge trials incorporated, in a supposedly judicial form, a wildly imaginative and devastating exercise in the paranoid style. In America, it has been the preferred style only of minority movements. It can be argued, of course, that certain features of our history have given the paranoid style more scope and force among us than it has had in many other countries of the Western world. My intention here, however, is not to make such a comparative judgment, but simply to establish the reality of the style and to illustrate its frequent historical recurrence. We may begin with a few American examples. Here is Senator McCarthy speaking in June 1951 about the parlous situation of the United States. How can we account for our present situation unless we believe that men high in this government are concerting to deliver us to disaster? This must be the product of a great conspiracy, a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man, a conspiracy of infamy so black that when it is finally exposed, its principles shall be forever deserving of the maledictions of all honest men. What can be made of this unbroken series of decisions and acts contributing to the strategy of defeat? They cannot be attributed to incompetence. No, the laws of probability would dictate that part of the decisions would serve the country's interests. Well, you're not here to listen to my Joe McCarthy impression. Now let us turn back 50 years to a manifesto signed in 1895 by a number of leaders in the Populist Party. As early as 1865 to 66, a conspiracy was entered into between the gold gamblers of Europe and America. For nearly 30 years, these conspirators have kept the people quarreling over less important matters, while they have pursued with unrelenting zeal one central purpose. Every device of treachery, every resource of statecraft, and every artifice known to the secret cabals of the international gold ring are being made use of to deal a blow to the prosperity of the people and the financial and commercial independence of the country. I want to say thank you for putting up with my silly voices for this long. The context behind this amusing rant goes back to a big political theme at this time, namely, should the United States use the gold standard, in which case we would back up our currency with gold, the silver standard, in which we would back up our currency with silver, or bimetallism, which would be backing up the currency with some combination of both. The populists were in favor of the silver standard, which is why they regularly are attacking so-called gold gamblers and people who would benefit from the gold standard in their oratory. Next, a Texas newspaper from 1855. It is a notorious fact that the monarchs of Europe and the Pope of Rome are at this very moment plotting our destruction and threatening the extinction of our political, civil, and religious instructions. We have been the best resources for believing that corruption has found its way into our executive chamber and that our executive head is tainted with the infectious venom of Catholicism. The Pope has recently sent his ambassador of state to this country on a secret commission, the effect of which is an extraordinary boldness of the Catholic Church throughout the United States. These minions of the Pope are boldly insulting our senators, reprimanding our statesmen, propagating the adulterous union of church and state, abusing with foul calumny all governments but Catholic, and spewing out the bitterest execrations on all Protestantism. The Catholics in the United States receive from abroad more than 200,000 annually for the propagation of their creed. Add this to the vast revenue collected here. Finally, this from a sermon preached in Massachusetts all the way back in 1798. Secret and systematic means have been adopted and pursued with zeal and activity by wicked and artful men in foreign countries to undermine the foundations of this religion, Christianity, and to overthrow its altars, and thus to deprive the world of its benign influence on society. These impious conspirators and philosophists have completely effected their purposes in a large portion of Europe, and boast of their means of accomplishing their plans in all parts of Christendom, glory in the certainty of their success, and set opposition at defiance. Man, I'm going to be banned from so many states after this. These quotations, taken from intervals of half a century, give the keynote of the style of thought. In the history of the United States, one finds, for example, in the Anti-Masonic Movement, the nativist and anti-Catholic movement, in certain spokesmen for abolitionism who regarded the United States as being in the grip of a slaveholders' conspiracy, in many writers alarmed by Mormonism, in some greenback and populist writers who constructed a great conspiracy of international bankers, in the exposure of a munitions makers' conspiracy of the First World War, in the popular left-wing press, in the contemporary American right wing, and on both sides of the race controversy today, among white citizens' councils and black Muslims. I do not propose to try to trace all variations of the paranoid style that can be found in all these movements, but I will confine myself to a few leading episodes in our past history in which the style emerged in full archetypical splendor. Section 2. A suitable point of departure is the panic that broke out in some quarters at the end of the 18th century over the allegedly subversive activities of the Bavarian Illuminati. This panic, which came with the general Western reaction to the French Revolution, was heightened here by the response of certain reactionaries, mostly in New England and among the established clergy, to the rise of Jeffersonian democracy. Illuminism had been founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, a professor of law at the University of Ingolstadt. Its teachings today seem to be no more than another version of Enlightenment rationalism, spiced with an anti-clerical animus that seems an inevitable response to the reactionary clerical atmosphere of 18th century Bavaria. A somewhat naive and utopian movement, which aspired ultimately to bring the human race under the rules of reason, it made many converts after 1780 among outstanding dukes and princes of the German states, and is reported to have had the allegiance of such men as Herder, Goethe, and Pestalozzi. Although the order of the Illuminati was shattered by persecution in its native principality, its humanitarian rationalism seems to have acquired a fairly wide influence in Masonic lodges. It is very easy to believe that it was attractive to some radicals with a conspiratorial cast of mind. Americans first learned of Illuminism in 1797 from a volume published in Edinburgh, later reprinted in New York, under the title Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe Carried On in the Secret Meetings of Freemasons, Illuminati, and Reading Societies. Its author was a well-known Scottish scientist, John Robinson, who had himself been a somewhat casual adherent of Masonry in Britain, but whose imagination had been inflamed by what he considered to be the far less innocent Masonic movement on the continent. Robinson's book was a conscientious account, laboriously pieced together out of the German sources, of the origins and development of Weishaupt's movement. For the most part, Robinson seems to have made his work as factual as he could, but when he came to estimating the moral character and political influence of Illuminism, he made the characteristic paranoid leap into fantasy. The association, he thought, was formed for the express purpose of rooting out all the religious establishments and overturning all the existing governments of Europe, end quote. The most active leaders of the French Revolution, he claimed, were members. It had become, quote, one great and wicked project, fermenting and working all over Europe, end quote. And to it he attributed a central role in bringing about the French Revolution. He saw it as a libertine, anti-Christian movement given to the corruption of women, the cultivation of sensual pleasures, and the violation of property rights. Its members had plans for making a tea that caused abortion, a secret substance that, quote, blinds or kills when spurted in the face, end quote, and a device that sounds like a stench bomb, a method for filling a bedchamber with pestilential vapors. Robinson's credulity was exercised not only on these matters, but also on a conviction that the Illuminati, while resolutely anti-Christian, were also heavily infiltrated by the Jesuits. Almost simultaneously with Robinson's book, there appeared in London a formidable 4-volume work by the Abbé Barruel, a Jesuit who had been expelled from France when that order was suppressed in 1773, under the title Mémoires pour servir la histoire du jacobinisme. I guess that would be the memories about the history of Jacobinism, or the Jacobins. All right. This work, which was translated into English and published both in England and in the United States, elaborated views similar to Robinson's and traced a quote-unquote triple conspiracy of anti-Christians, Freemasons, and Illuminati to destroy religion and order. We shall demonstrate, wrote Barruel, what is imperative for the nations and their leaders to know. We shall say to them, everything in the French Revolution, even the most dreadful of crimes, was foreseen, contemplated, contrived, resolved upon, decreed, that everything was the consequence of the most profound villainy, and was prepared and produced by those men who alone held the leading threads of conspiracies long before woven in the secret societies, and who knew how to choose and to hasten the favorable moments for their schemes. Although among the day-by-day events there were some circumstances which hardly seemed the effects of conspiracies, there existed nonetheless one cause with its secret agents, who called forth these events, who knew how to profit by circumstances or even how to bring them about, and who directed everything towards their main end. The circumstances may have served as the pretext and the opportunity, but the grand cause of the revolution, of its great crimes, its huge atrocities, was always independent and self-contained, and it consisted in plots long hatched and deeply premeditated. These notions were quick to make themselves felt in America, even though it is uncertain whether any member of the Illuminati ever came here. In May 1798, a prominent minister of the Massachusetts Congregational Establishment in Boston, Jedediah Morse, delivered a timely sermon of great import to the young country, which was then sharply divided between the Jeffersonians and Federalists, Francophiles and Anglophiles. After reading Robinson, Morse was convinced that the United States, too, was the victim of a Jacobinal plot touched off by Illuminism, and that the country should be rallied to defend itself against the machinations of the international conspiracy. His warnings were heeded throughout New England, wherever Federalists brooded about the rising tide of religious infidelity or Jeffersonian democracy. Timothy Dwight, the president of Yale, followed Morse's sermon with a 4th of July discourse called The Duty of Americans in the Present Crisis, in which he held forth against the Antichrist in his own glowing rhetoric. The sins of these enemies of Christ and Christians are numbers and degrees which mock account and description. All that the malice and atheism of the dragon, the cruelty and rapacity of the beast, and the fraud and deceit of the false prophet can generate or accomplish swell the list. No personal or national interest of man has been uninvaded. No impious sentiment or action against God has been spared. Shall we, my brethren, become partakers of these sins? Shall we introduce them into our government, our schools, our families? Shall our sons become the disciples of Voltaire and the dragoons of Marat? Or our daughters the concubines of the Illuminati? The note was taken up by others, and soon the pulpits of New England were ringing with denunciations of the Illuminati, as though the country were swarming with them. The prevalence of these denunciations is more intelligible if one remembers that the United States did have, if not any Illuminati, a few democratic Republican societies which were widely believed to be Jacobinical and to have instigated the Whiskey Rebellion. It was now generally believed, as one preacher put it, that the present day is unfolding a design, the most extensive, flagitious, and diabolical that human art and malice have ever invented. Its object is the total destruction of all religion and civil order. If accomplished, the earth can be nothing better than a sink of impurities, a theater of violence and murder, and a hell of miseries. These writers illustrate the central preconception of the paranoid style, the existence of a vast, insidious, pre-eternally effective, international conspiratorial network designed to perpetuate acts of the most fiendish character. There are, of course, certain ancillary themes which appear less frequently, but before going on to characterize the other motifs in the paranoid style, let us look at a few more historical manifestations. The Anti-Masonic movement of the late 1820s and 30s took up and extended the obsession with conspiracy. At first blush, this movement may seem to be no more than an extension or repetition of the anti-Masonic theme sounded in the earlier outcry against the Bavarian Illuminati, and indeed the works of writers like Robison and Barrell were often cited as evidence of the sinister character of Masonry. But whereas the panic of the 1790s was confined mainly to New England and linked to an ultra-conservative argument, the later anti-Masonic movement affected many parts of the northern United States and was altogether congenial to popular democracy and rural egalitarianism. Richard Hofstadter has a footnote here which reads, "The status of those who were opposed by these anti-movements of the 19th century varied widely. Freemasonry was largely an affair of the upper crust of society. Catholics were predominantly poor immigrants. Mormons drew their strength from the native rural middle class. Ironically, the victims themselves were associated with similar anti-sentiments. Freemasonry had strong anti-Catholic associations, Mormons were anti-Catholic, and, to a degree, anti-Masonic. Yet their detractors did not hesitate to couple staunch foes. It was sometimes said, for example, that the Jesuits had infiltrated Freemasonry, and that the menace of Catholicism was frequently compared with the menace of Mormonism. All these movements had an interest for minds obsessed with secrecy and concerned with all or nothing world struggle over ultimate values. The ecumenism of hatred is a great breaker down of precise intellectual discrimination." Although anti-Masonry happened to be anti-Jacksonian, as Jackson was a Mason himself, it showed the same fear that opportunities for the common man would be closed, the same passionate dislike of aristocratic institutions that one finds in Jacksonian crusade against the Bank of the United States. So during Andrew Jackson's presidency in the 1820s, one of his main themes was opposition to the Bank of the United States. While I won't go into the exact reasons as to why he opposed it so vehemently, I can say that he and his supporters saw it as, well, as Hofstadter pointed out, rather aristocratic, serving the elites rather than the common people. The anti-Masonic movement, though a product of spontaneous enthusiasm, soon fell victim to the changing fortunes of party politics. It was joined and used by a great many men who did not share its original anti-Masonic feelings. It attracted, for example, the support of several reputable statesmen who had only mild sympathy with its fundamental bias, but who as politicians could not afford to ignore it. Still, it was a folk movement of considerable power, and the rural enthusiasts who provided its real impetus believed in it wholeheartedly. There must have been some considerable suspicion of the Masonic order, to begin with, perhaps a residue of the feeling against Illuminism. At any rate, the movement was precipitated by the mysterious disappearance of one William Morgan in 1826. Morgan was an ex-Mason living in western New York State who was at work on a book exposing the order. There can be no doubt that he was abducted by a small group of Masons, and it was widely and quite understandably believed that if he had been murdered, although no certainly identifiable body was ever found, the details of the case need not detain us. Morgan's disappearance was followed by an outbreak of similar charges against Masons, invariably unfounded, of other conspiracies to kidnap or hold in false imprisonment. Within very short order, an anti-Masonic party was making itself felt in the politics of New York State, and the party soon became national. But it's its ideology, not its political history, that concerns us here. As a secret society, Masonry was considered to be a standing conspiracy against Republican government. It was held to be particularly liable to treason. For example, Aaron Burr's famous conspiracy was alleged to have been conducted by the Masons. Masonry was also accused of constituting a separate system of loyalty, a separate imperium within the framework of American and state governments, inconsistent with loyalty to them. Quite plausibly, it was argued that the Masons had set up a jurisdiction of their own, with their own obligations and punishments, liable to enforcement even by the penalty of death. Anti-Masons were fascinated by the horrid oaths that Masons were said to take, invoking terrible reprisals upon themselves if they should fail in their Masonic obligations. The conflict between secrecy and democracy was felt to be so basic that other more innocent societies, such as Phi Beta Kappa, also came under attack. Since Masons were pledged to come to each other's aid under circumstances of distress and to extend fraternal indulgence at all times, it was held that the order nullified the enforcement of regular law. Masonic constables, sheriffs, juries, judges, and the like would all be in league with Masonic criminals and fugitives. The press, too, was said to have been so muzzled by Masonic editors and proprietors that news of Masonic malfeasance could be suppressed, which was the main reason why so shocking a scandal as the Morgan case had received relatively little publicity. Finally, in a moment when practically every alleged citadel of privilege in America was under democratic assault, Masonry was held to be a fraternity of the privileged classes, closing business opportunities and nearly monopolizing political offices, thus shutting out hardy common citizens of the type the Anti-Masonic Movement liked to claim for its own. If you ever have some spare time, go to the Wikipedia page for the Anti-Masonic Party and check out all the offices that the Anti-Masonic Party ended up holding. They sent a lot of representatives to the House of Representatives. They never had any senators, but they did have a lot of local and statewide elected offices. In fact, in the presidential election of 1832, they won the state of Vermont. Somehow. There may have been certain elements of truth and reality in these views of Masonry, and many distinguished and responsible leaders accepted them, at least in part. Not all of these charges and fears need be dismissed as entirely without foundation. What must be emphasized here, however, is the apocalyptic and absolutist framework in which this hostility to Masonry was usually expressed. Anti-Masons were not content simply to say that secret societies were a rather bad idea. David Bernard, in the Standard Handbook of Anti-Masonic Materials, called Light on Masonry, declared that Freemasonry was the most dangerous institution that ever was imposed on man. Quote, an engine of Satan, dark, unfruitful, selfish, demoralizing, blasphemous, murderous, anti-republican, and anti-Christian. End quote. One of the many anti-Masonic pulpit orators called the order, quote, a work of the darkness because it bears decided marks of being one of the confederate powers of iniquity predicted by the Apostle John, which would combine the world in arms against God and be overcome at the battle of the great day just before the millennium. A further aspect of anti-Masonry that is at once arresting and puzzling to the modern mind is its obsession with the character of Masonic oaths. Oaths were considered to be blasphemous, since they were profanations of a transaction with God, and contrary to civil order, since they set up a secret pattern of loyalties inconsistent with normal civil obligations. At the first National Anti-Masonic Convention, a committee spent a great deal of time solemnly demonstrating that such oaths were subversive, and could not be regarded as binding commitments. Many anti-Masons were particularly fascinated by the penalties invoked if Masons failed to live up to their obligations, and these penalties were ingeniously and bloodily imagined. The Mark Master Mason was alleged to call down upon himself having my right ear smote off and my right hand chopped off as an impostor in the event of such a failure. My own favorite oath attributed to a Royal Archmason who invited, quote, having my skull smote off and my brains exposed to the scorching rays of the sun, end quote. The sanguinary character of Masonry was also thought to be shown by the ritual of the lodges, which supposedly required the drinking of wine from human skulls. This in temperance communities, where drinking wine from any kind of container was considered a sin. Part 3. Fear of a Masonic plot had hardly been quieted when the rumors arose of a Catholic plot against American values. One finds here again the same frame of mind, the same conviction of a conspiracy against a way of life, but now a different villain. Of course, the anti-Catholic movement converged with a growing nativism, and while they were not identical, together they cut such a wide swath in American life that they were bound to embrace many moderates to whom the paranoid style in its full glory did not appeal. Moreover, we need not dismiss out of hand as wholly parochial or mean-spirited the desire of Yankee Americans to maintain an ethnically and religiously homogeneous society, nor the particular Protestant commitments to individualism and freedom that were brought into play. But the movement had a large paranoid infusion, and the most influential anti-Catholic militants certainly had strong affinities for the paranoid style. Two books which appeared in 1835 described the new danger to the American way of life, and may be taken as expressions of anti-Catholic mentality. One, called Foreign Conspiracies Against the Liberties of the United States, was from the hand of the celebrated painter and inventor of the telegraph, S.F.B. Morse, who was the son of Jedediah Morse, the anti-illuminist. "A conspiracy exists," Morse proclaimed, "and its plans are already in operation. We are attacked in a vulnerable quarter which cannot be defined by our ships, our forts, or our armies." In the great war going on in the Western world between political reaction and ultramontanism on one side and political and religious liberties on the other, America was a bastion of freedom, and hence an inevitable target for popes and despots. The main source of the conspiracy Morse found in Metternich's government. Austria is now acting in this country. She has devised a grand scheme. She has organized a great plan for doing something here. She has her Jesuit missionaries traveling through the land. She has supplied them with money, and has furnished a fountain for a regular supply. End quote. It is an ascertained fact, wrote another Protestant militant, that Jesuits are prowling about all parts of the United States in every possible disguise, expressly to ascertain the advantageous situations and modes to disseminate popery. A minister of the gospel from Ohio has informed us that he discovered one carrying on his devices in his congregation, and he says that the western country swarms with them under the names of puppet showmen, dancing masters, music teachers, peddlers of images and ornaments, barrel organ players, and similar practitioners. End quote. Were the plot successful, Morse said, it would not be long before some scion of the House of Habsburg would be installed as Emperor of the United States. Catholics working, quote, with the minds and funds of all despotic Europe, end quote, were the only possible channel of this influence. Ignorant, ill-educated immigrants incapable of understanding the instructions of the United States would supplement the efforts of wily Jesuit agents. The danger was imminent and must have been met at once. Quote, "The serpent has already commenced his coil about our limbs, and the lethargy of his poison is creeping over us. Is the enemy already organized in the land? Can we not perceive all around us the evidence of his presence? We must awake, or we are lost." End quote. Lyman Beecher, the elder of a famous family and the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, wrote in the same year in his Plea for the West, in which he considered the possibility that the Christian millennium might come in the American states. Everything depended in his judgment upon what influences dominated the Great West. Where the future of the country lay, there Protestantism was engaged in a life-or-death struggle with Catholicism. Time was already running out. Quote, "Whatever we do, it must be done quickly." End quote. A great tide of immigration, hostile to free institutions, was sweeping in upon the country, subsidized and sent by, quote, "the potentates of Europe," end quote, multiplying tumult and violence, filling jails, crowding poorhouses, quadrupling taxation, and sending increasing thousands of voters to, quote, "lay their inexperienced hand upon the helm of our power," end quote. Well might we believe, said Beecher, that Metternich knew that there would be a party in the United States willing to hasten the naturalization and enfranchisement of these multitudes and demagogues, a party that would, quote, "sell their country into an everlasting bondage," end quote. Even so much as a tenth of the voting population, quote, "condensed and wielded by the Catholic powers of Europe, might decide our elections, perplex our policy, inflame and divide the nation, break the bond of our union, and throw down our free institutions," end quote. Beecher did not approve violations of the civil rights of Catholics or the burning of convents, but he urged Protestants to a greater militancy and solidarity to fend off a fate that might be waiting for them in a not-so-distant future. Anti-Catholicism has always been the pornography of the Puritan. whereas the anti-Masons had imagined wild drinking bouts and had entertained themselves with fantasies about the actual enforcement of grisly Masonic oaths, the anti-Catholics developed an immense lore about libertine priests, the confessional as an opportunity for seduction, licentious converts, and monasteries, and the like. Probably the most widely read contemporary book in the United States before Uncle Tom's Cabin was a work supposedly written by one Maria Monk called Artful Disclosures, which appeared in 1836. The author, who purported to have escaped from the Hôtel Dieu nunnery in Montreal after a residence of 5 years as a novice and nun, reported her convent life there in elaborate and circumstantial detail. She recalled having been told by the Mother Superior that she must, quote, obey the priests in all things, end quote, and to her, quote, utter astonishment and horror, end quote, she soon found what the nature of such obedience was. Infants born of convent liaisons were baptized and then killed, she said, so that they might ascend at once to heaven. A high point of the awful disclosures was Maria Monk's eyewitness account of the strangling of 2 babies. Her book, hotly attacked and hotly defended, continued to be read and believed even after her mother, a Protestant living near Montreal, gave testimony that Maria had been somewhat addled ever since childhood when she rammed a pencil into her head. It was indeed read and believed by a dwindling audience, even when poor Maria produced a fatherless child 2 years after the appearance of her book. She died in a prison in 1849 after having been arrested in a brothel as a pickpocket. Anti-Catholicism, like anti-Masonry, mixed its fortunes with American party politics. To trace its political career would take us too far afield, but it did become an enduring factor in American politics. The American Protective Association of the 1890s revived it with ideological variations more suitable to the times. The Depression of 1893, for example, was alleged to be an intentional creation of the Catholics, who began it by starting a run on the banks. Some spokesman of the movement circulated a bogus encyclical attributed to Pope Leo XIII, instructing American Catholics on a certain date in 1893 to exterminate all heretics, and a great many anti-Catholics daily expected a nationwide uprising. The myth of an impending Catholic war of mutilation and extermination of heretics persisted into the 20th century. Part 4. If we now take the long jump to the contemporary right wing, we find some rather important differences from the 19th century movements. The spokesmen of these earlier movements felt they stood for causes and personal types that were still in possession of their country, that they were fending off threats to a still well-established way of life in which they played an important part. But the modern right wing, as Daniel Bell puts it, feels dispossessed. America has largely been taken away from them and their kind, though they are determined to try to repossess it and to prevent the final destructive act of subversion. The old American virtues have already been eaten away by cosmopolitans and intellectuals. The old competitive capitalism has been gradually undermined by socialist and communist schemers. The old national security and independence have been destroyed by treasonous plots, having as their most powerful agents not merely outsiders and foreigners, but major statesmen seated at the very centers of American power. Their predecessors discovered foreign conspiracies. The modern radical right finds that conspiracy also embraces betrayal at home. Important changes may be traced to the effects of the mass media. The villains of the modern right are much more vivid than those of their paranoid predecessors, much better known to the public. The contemporary literature of the paranoid style is, by the same token, richer and more circumstantial in personal description and personal invective. For the vaguely delineated villains of the anti-Masons, for the obscure and disguised Jesuit agents, the little-known papal delegates of the anti-Catholics, for the shadowy international bankers of the monetary conspiracies, we may now substitute eminent public figures like Presidents Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower, Secretaries of State like Marshall, Atchison, and Dulles, Justices of the Supreme Court like Frankfurter and Warren, and the whole battery of lesser but still famous and vivid conspirators headed by Alger Hiss. While the other names mentioned were accused of being communists, Alger Hiss was actually convicted of selling American state secrets to the Soviet Union. Since he was actually convicted, many old-school anti-communist paranoids used him as evidence that there were communists lurking about within the government. Events since 1939 have given the contemporary right wing paranoid, a vast theater for his imagination, full of rich and proliferating detail, replete with realistic clues and unthinkable proofs of the validity of his views. The theater of action is now the entire world, and he can draw on not only the events of the Second World War, but those of the Korean War and the Cold War. Any historian of warfare knows that it is, in good part, a comedy of errors and a museum of incompetence. But if for every error and every act of incompetence one can substitute an act of treason, we can see how many points of fascinating interpretation are open to the paranoid imagination. Treason in high places can be found at almost every turning, and in the end, the real mystery for one who reads the primary works of paranoid scholarship is not how the United States has been brought to its present dangerous position, but how it has managed to survive at all. The basic elements of contemporary right-wing thought can be reduced to three. First, there has been the now familiar sustained conspiracy, running over more than a generation and reaching its climax in Roosevelt's New Deal, to undermine free capitalism, to bring the economy under the direction of the federal government, and to pave the way for socialism or communism. Details might be open to argument. But many would agree with Frank Chodrow, the author of The Income Tax, the Root of All Evil, that this campaign began with the passage of the Income Tax Amendment to the Constitution in 1913. Hofstadter leaves a footnote here which goes into a little more detail. For a good brief summary of the history of this alleged conspiracy, see Chessie Manley's book, The 20-Year Revolution, From Roosevelt to Eisenhower, which traces all aspects of the quote-unquote revolution and finds in the United Nations, quote, the principal instrument of a gigantic conspiracy to control the foreign and domestic policies of the United States, subvert the Constitution, and establish a totalitarian society, end quote. A more recent and much more widely read work, particularly popular in the Goldwater movement, is Phyllis Schlafly's A Choice Not an Echo, which traces the work of a small group of quote-unquote secret kingmakers in New York who have controlled the affairs of the Republican Party from 1936 to 1960. The author believes that Republicans have so many issues on their side that, quote, there is no way Republicans can possibly lose so long as we have a presidential candidate who campaigns on the issues, end quote. However, they have lost 4 major presidential campaigns because, quote, a small group of secret kingmakers using hidden persuaders and psychological warfare techniques manipulated the Republican National Convention to nominate candidates who would sidestep or suppress the key issues, end quote. A more substantial contemporary manual of conspiratorial views, which traces ramifications in many areas of American life, is John A. Stormer's None Dare Call It Treason. The writer asks, is there a conspiratorial plan to destroy the United States, into which foreign aid, planned inflation, distortion of treaty-making powers, and disarmament all fit? He answers subtly that it makes no difference whether this is all planned or is merely the work of misguided idealists, as the fact is that all the pieces exist. They fit the pattern whether they were planned by the communists or some other secret and mysterious revolutionary group, or not. Those who constructed the pieces are few in number, but they exert fantastic control in government, financial circles, the press, unions, schools, etc. The second contention is that top government officialdom has been so infiltrated by the communists that American policy, at least since the days leading up to Pearl Harbor, has been dominated by sinister men who were shrewdly and consistently selling out American national interests. The final contention is that the country is infused with a network of communist agents, just as in the old days it was infiltrated by Jesuit agents, so that the whole apparatus of education, religion, the press, and the mass media are engaged in a common effort to paralyze the resistance of loyal Americans. The details of the modern right-wing case are beyond the scope of any brief discussion. Perhaps the most representative document of its McCarthyist phase was a long indictment of Secretary of State George C. Marshall, delivered in the Senate on June 14, 1951 by Senator McCarthy, and later published in a somewhat different form as America's Retreat from Victory, the story of George Catlett Marshall. McCarthy pictured Marshall as the focal figure in a betrayal of American interests stretching in time from the strategic plans for the Second World War to the formulation of the Marshall Plan. Marshall was associated with practically every American failure or defeat, McCarthy insisted, and none of this was due to either accident or incompetence. There was a, quote, baffling pattern of Marshall's interventions in the war, quote, his decisions, maintained with great stubbornness and skill, always and invariably served the world policy of the Kremlin, end quote. Under his guidance, there was conducted at the end of the war, quote, what appeared to be a planned loss of the peace, end quote. Marshall's report on his mission to China cannot be understood as the product of incompetence, but appears persuasive and brilliant when it reads as, quote, a propaganda document in behalf of other interests, another country, and civilization, end quote. Marshall and Atchison were intent on delivering China to Russia. The Marshall Plan was, quote, an evil hoax on the generosity, goodwill, and carelessness of the American people, end quote. And above all, the sharp decline in America's relative strength from 1945 to 1951 did not just happen. It was brought about step by step by will and intention. The consequence, not of mistakes, but of treasonous conspiracy. Quote, a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man, end quote. The ultimate aim of this conspiracy was, quote, that we shall be contained and frustrated and finally fall victim to Soviet intrigue from within and Russian military might from without, end quote. Today the mantle of McCarthy has fallen on the retired candy manufacturer Robert H. Welch, Jr., who is less strategically placed, but whose well-organized following in the John Birch Society has had a strong influence. A few years ago, Welch proclaimed that communist influences are now in almost complete control of our federal government. Note the care and scrupulousness of that almost. He has offered a full-scale interpretation of our recent history in which communists figure at every turn. They started a run on American banks in 1933 that forced their closure. They contrived the recognition of the Soviet Union by the United States that same year, just in time to save the Soviets from economic collapse. They have stirred up the fuss over segregation. They have taken over the Supreme Court and made it, quote, one of the most important agencies of communism. They are winning the struggle for control in the press, the pulpit, the radio and television media, the labor unions, the schools, the courts, and the legislative halls of America, end quote. Close attention to history wins for Mr. Welch an insight into affairs that is given to few of us. For many reasons, and after a lot of study, he wrote some years ago, I personally believe John Foster Dulles to be a communist agent. Other apparently innocent figures are similarly unmasked. The job of Professor Arthur F. Burns as the head of Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors quite possibly was merely a cover-up for Burns's liaison work between Eisenhower and some of his bosses in the establishment. Eisenhower's brother Milton was actually his superior and boss within the whole left-wing establishment. As for Eisenhower himself, Welch characterized him in the words that have made the candy manufacturer famous as a dedicated, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy, a conclusion, he added, based on an accumulation of detailed evidence so extensive and so palpable that it seems to put this conviction beyond any reasonable doubt. The infamous accusation of Dwight Eisenhower as a communist probably is the single most infamous thing to ever come out of the John Birch Society. It rendered them a complete and total laughingstock. Honestly, can you remember? I mean, there used to be a time when accusing the president of being a communist would make you a laughingstock or even a pariah. Nowadays, it's kind of expected. Seriously, like, my grandparents legit believe that Obama is a radical leftist Marxist, and even the, notoriously moderate Joe Biden is also a secret communist too. Can't wait for Joe Manchin to be labeled a commie at some point. The views for which Mr. Welch carefully gathers detailed evidence are expressed with less scholarly responsibility by a small but vocal segment of the public. Recently, Republican Senator Thomas R. Kuchel, the minority whip of the Senate, revealed that of the 60,000 letters he receives each month, about 10% may be classified as what he calls fright mail, indigent or anguished letters about the latest plot to overthrow America. The imagination of his correspondence is feverishly at work. Some of the more memorable plots that come to mind include these: 35,000 communist Chinese troops bearing arms and wearing deceptively dyed powder blue uniforms are poised on the Mexican border about to invade San Diego. The United States has turned over, or will at any moment, its Army, Navy, and Air Force to the command of a Russian colonel in the United Nations. Almost every well-known American or free world leader is in reality a top communist agent. A United States Army guerrilla warfare exercise in Georgia called Walter Moccasin III is in actuality a United Nations operation preparing to take over our country. Section 5. Let us now abstract the basic elements in the paranoid style. The central image is that of a vast and sinister conspiracy, a gigantic and yet subtle machinery of influence set in motion to undermine and destroy a way of life. One may object that there are conspiratorial acts in history, and there is nothing paranoid about taking note of them. This is true. All political behavior requires a strategy. Many strategic acts depend for their effect upon a period of secrecy, and anything that is secret may be described, often with but little exaggeration, as conspiratorial. The distinguishing thing about the paranoid style is not that its exponents see conspiracies or plots here and there in history, but that they regard a vast or gigantic conspiracy as the motive force in historical events. History is a conspiracy set in motion by demonic forces of almost transcendent power, and what is felt to be needed to defeat it is not the usual methods of political give and take, but an all-out crusade. The paranoid spokesman sees the fate of this conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. He is always manning the barricades of civilization. He constantly lives at the turning point. It is now or never in organizing resistance to conspiracy. Time is forever just running out. Like religious millenarians, he expresses the anxiety of those who are living through the last days, and he is sometimes disposed to set a date for the apocalypse. Time is running out, said Welch in 1951. Evidence is piling up on many sides and from many sources that October 1952 is the fatal month when Stalin will attack. The apocalypticism of the paranoid style runs dangerously near to hopeless pessimism, but usually stops short of it. Apocalyptic warnings arouse passion and militancy, and strike at susceptibility to similar themes in Christianity. Properly expressed, such warnings serve somewhat the same function as a description of the horrible consequences of sin in a revivalist's sermon. They portray that which impends, but which may still be avoided. They are a secular and demonic vision of Adventism. As a member of the avant-garde, who is capable of perceiving the conspiracy before it is fully obvious to an as-of-yet unaroused public, the paranoid is a militant leader. He does not see social conflict as something to be mediated and compromised in the manner of the working politician. Since what is at stake is always a conflict between absolute good and absolute evil, the quality needed is not a willingness to compromise, but the will to fight things out to a finish. Nothing but complete victory will do, since the enemy is thought of as being totally evil and totally unappeasable. He must be totally eliminated, if not from the world, at least from the theater of operations to which the paranoid directs his attention. This demand for unqualified victories leads to the formulation of hopelessly demanding, unrealistic goals, and since these goals are not even remotely attainable, failure consistently heightens the paranoid's frustration. Even partial success leaves him with the same sense of powerlessness with which he began, and this in turn only strengthens his awareness of the vast and terrifying quality of the enemy he opposes. This enemy is clearly delineated. He is a perfect model of malice, a kind of amoral Superman, sinister, ubiquitous, powerful, cruel, sensual, luxury-loving. Unlike the rest of us, the enemy is not caught in the toils of the vast mechanism of history, himself a victim of his past, his desires, his limitations. He is a free, active, demonic agent. He wills, indeed, he manufactures the mechanism of history himself, or deflects the normal course of history in an evil way. He makes crises, starts runs on banks, causes depressions, manufactures disasters, and then enjoys and profits from the misery he has produced. The paranoid's interpretation of history is in this sense distinctly personal. Decisive events are not taken as part of the stream of history, but as the consequences of someone's will. Very often the enemy is held to possess some especially effective source of power. He controls the press. He directs the public mind through managed news. He has unlimited funds. He has a new secret for influencing the mind, like brainwashing. He has a special technique for seduction, like the Catholic confessional. He is gaining a stronghold on the educational system. The enemy seems to be on many counts a projection of the self. Both the ideal and the unacceptable aspect of the self are attributed to him. A fundamental paradox of the paranoid style is the imitation of the enemy. The enemy, for example, may be the cosmopolitan intellectual, but the paranoid will outdo him in the apparatus of scholarship, even of pedantry. Senator McCarthy, with his heavily documented tracts and his show of information, Mr. Welch with his accumulations of irresistible evidence, John Robinson with his laborious study documents in a language he but poorly used, the anti-Masons with their endlessly painstaking discussions of Masonic ritual, all these offer a kind of implicit compliment to their opponents. Secret organizations set up to combat secret organizations give the same flattery. The Ku Klux Klan imitated Catholicism to the point of donning priestly vestments, developing an elaborate ritual and an equally elaborate hierarchy. The John Birch Society emulates communist cells in quasi-secret operation through front groups and preaches a ruthless prosecution of the ideological war along lines very similar to those it finds in the communist enemy. Spokesmen of the various Christian anti-communist crusades openly express their admiration for the dedication, discipline, and strategic ingenuity the communist cause calls forth. An interesting footnote is here. This has now become a fashionable trend in more respectable quarters. Stephen Shadegg, known for his success in Senator Goldwater's senatorial campaigns, writes, Mao Zedong has written a valuable book on the tactics of infiltration. In it he says, "Give me just 2 or 3 men in a village and I will take the village." In the Goldwater campaigns of 52 and 58 for Senate, and in all other campaigns where I have served as consultant, I have followed the advice of Mao Zedong. Writing about Cold War strategy, Goldwater himself declares, "I would suggest that we analyze and copy the strategy of the enemy. Theirs has worked, and ours has not." David Bryan Davis, in a remarkable essay on pre-Civil War counter-subversive movements, has commented on the manner in which 19th century nativists unwittingly fashioned himself after his enemy. Quote, "As the nativists searched for participation in a noble cause for unity in a group sanctioned by tradition and authority, he professed a belief in democracy and equal rights. Yet, in his very zeal for freedom, he curiously assumed many of the characteristics of the imagined enemy. By condemning these subversives' fanatical allegiance to an ideology, he affirmed a similarly uncritical acceptance of a different ideology. By attacking the subversives' intolerance of dissent, he worked to eliminate dissent and diversity of opinion. By censuring the subversive for alleged licentiousness, he engaged in sensual fantasies. By criticizing the subversive loyalty to an organization, he sought to prove his own unconditional loyalty to an established order. The nativist moved even farther in the direction of his enemies when he formed tightly knit societies and parties which were often secret and which often subordinated the individual to the single purpose of the group. Though the nativists generally agreed that the worst evil of subversives was their subordination of means to ends, they themselves recommended the most radical means to purge the nation of the troublesome groups and to enforce unquestioned loyalty to the state. Much of the function of the enemy lies not in what can be imitated, but in what can be wholly condemned. The sexual freedom often attributed to him, his lack of moral inhibition, his possession of especially effective techniques for fulfilling his desires give exponents of the paranoid style an opportunity to project and freely express unacceptable aspects of their own minds. Priests and Mormon patriarchs were commonly thought to have special attraction for women, and hence licentious privileged. Thus Catholics and Mormons, later Negroes and Jews, lent themselves to a preoccupation with illicit sex. Very often the fantasies of the true believers serve as strong sadomasochistic outlets, vividly expressed, for example, in the concern of anti-Masons with the alleged cruelty of Masonic punishments. Concerning this punishment, David remarks, Masons disemboweled or slit the throats of their victims. Catholics cut unborn infants from their mothers' wombs and threw them onto the dogs before their parents' eyes. Mormons raped and lashed recreant women or seared off their mouths with red-hot iron. This obsession with details of sadism, which reached pathological proportions in much of the literature, showed a furious determination to purge the enemy of every admirable quality. Another recurring aspect of the paranoid style is the special significance that attaches to the figure of the renegade from the enemy cause. The Anti-Masonic movement seemed at times to be the creation of ex-Masons. It certainly attached the highest significance and gave the most unqualified credulity to their revelations. Similarly, anti-Catholicism used the runaway nun and the apostate priest. Anti-Mormonism used the ex-wife from the harem of polygamy. The avant-garde anti-communist movements of our time used the ex-communist. In some part, the special authority accorded to the renegade derives from the obsession with secrecy, so characteristic of such movements. The renegade is the man or woman who has been in the secret world of the enemy and brings forth with him or her the final verification of suspicions, which might otherwise have been doubted by a skeptical world. But I think there is a deeper eschatological significance attached to the person of the renegade, in spiritual wrestling match between good and evil, which is the paranoid's archetypal model of the world struggle. The renegade is living proof that all the conversions are not made by the wrong side. He brings with him the promise of redemption and victory. In contemporary right-wing movements, a particularly important part has been played by ex-communists, who have moved rapidly, though not without anguish, from the paranoid left to the paranoid right, clinging all the while to the fundamentally Manichaean philosophy that underlies both. Such authorities on communism remind one of those ancient converts from paganism to Christianity, of whom it is told that upon their conversion they did not entirely cease to believe in their old gods, but converted them into demons. A final aspect of the paranoid style is related to that quality of pedantry to which I have already referred. One of the impressive things about paranoid literature is precisely the elaborate concern with demonstration it almost invariably shows. One should not be misled by the fantastic conclusions that are so characteristic of this political style, into imagining that it is not, so to speak, argued out along factual lines. The very fantastic character of its conclusions leads to heroic strivings for evidence to prove the unbelievable is only thing that can be believed. Of course, there are highbrow, lowbrow, and middlebrow paranoids, as there are likely to be in any political tendency, and paranoid movements from the Middle Ages onward have had a magnetic attraction for demi-intellectuals. But respectable paranoid literature not only starts from certain moral commitments that can be justified to many non-paranoids, but also carefully and all but obsessively accumulates quote-unquote evidence. Paranoid writing begins with certain defensible judgments. There was something to be said for the anti-Masons. After all, a secret society composed of influential men bound by special obligations could conceivably pose some kind of threat to the civil order, in which they were suspended. There was also something to be said for the Protestant principles of individuality and freedom, as well as for the nativist desire to develop in North America a homogeneous civilization. Again, in our time, innumerable decisions of the Second World War and the Cold War can be faulted, and it is easy for the suspicious to believe that such decisions are not simply the mistakes of well-meaning men, but the plans of traitors. The typical procedure of the higher paranoid scholarship is to start with such defensible assumptions and with a careful accumulation of facts, or at least of what appear to be facts, and to marshal these facts towards an overwhelming proof of the particular conspiracy that is to be established. It is nothing if not coherent, in fact. The paranoid mentality is far more coherent than the real world. Since it leaves no room for mistakes, failures, or ambiguities, it is, if not wholly rational, at least intentionally rationalistic. It believes that it is up against an enemy who is as infallibly rational as he is totally evil, and it seeks to match his imputed total competence with its own, leaving nothing unexplained and comprehending all of reality in one overreaching, consistent theory. It is nothing if not scholarly in critique. McCarthy's 96-page pamphlet, McCarthyism, contains no less than 313 footnote references, and Mr. Welch's fantastic assault on Eisenhower, the politician, is weighed down by 100 pages of bibliography and footnotes. The entire right-wing movement of our time is a parade of experts, study groups, monographs, footnotes, and bibliographies. Sometimes the right wing striving for scholarly depth and an inclusive worldview has startling consequences. Mr. Welch, for example, has charged that the popularity of Arnold Toynbee's historical work is the consequence of a plot on the part of the Fabians, quote, Labour Party bosses in England, and various members of the Anglo-American liberal establishment to overshadow the much more truthful and illuminating works of Oswald Spengler. I just wanted to add that at this point in time, Oswald Spengler was dead and Arnold Toynbee was still alive. Now, call me a little crazy, but I think it's a lot easier to promote your historical writing if you're still alive. Just saying. What distinguishes the paranoid style is not then the absence of verifiable facts, though it is occasionally true that in his extravagant passion for facts, the paranoid occasionally manufactures them, but rather the curious leap in imagination that is always made at some critical point in the recital of events. John Robinson's tract on the Illuminati followed a pattern that has been repeated for over a century and a half. For page after page, he patiently records the details he has been able to accumulate about the history of the Illuminati. Then, suddenly, the French Revolution has taken place, and the Illuminati have brought it about. What is missing is not veracious information about the organization, but sensible judgment about what can cause a revolution. The plausibility the paranoid style has for those who find it plausible lies, in good measure, in this appearance of the most careful, conscientious, and seemingly coherent application to detail. The laborious accumulation of what can be taken as convincing evidence for the most fantastic conclusions, the careful preparation for the big leap from the undeniable to the unbelievable. The singular thing about all this laborious work is that the passion for factual evidence does not, as in most intellectual exchanges, have the effect of putting the paranoid spokesman into effective two-way communication with the world outside his group, least of all with those who doubt his views. He has little real hope that his evidence will convince a hostile world. His effort to amass it is rather the quality of a defensive act which shuts off his receptive apparatus and protects him from having to attend to the disturbing considerations that do not fortify his ideas. He has all the evidence he needs. He is not a receiver. He is a transmitter. Since I have drawn so heavily on American examples, I would like to emphasize again that the paranoid style is an international phenomenon. Nor is it confined to modern times. Studying the millennial sects of Europe from the 11th to 16th century, Norman Cohn finds in his brilliant book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, a persistent psychological complex that closely resembles what I have been considering, a style made up of certain marked preoccupations and fantasies. Quote, the megalomaniac view of oneself as elect, wholly good, abominably persecuted, yet assured of ultimate triumph, the attribution of gigantic and demonic powers to the adversary, the refusal to accept the ineluctable limitations and imperfections of human existence, such as transience, dissension, conflict, fallibility, whether intellectual or moral, the obsession with inerrable prophecies, systematized misrepresentations, always gross and often grotesque, ruthlessness directed towards an end which by its very nature cannot be realized, towards a total and final solution, such as cannot be attained at any actual time or in any concrete situation, but only in the timeless and autistic realm of fantasy. End quote. The recurrence of the paranoid style over a long span of time and in different places suggests that a mentality disposed to see the world in a paranoid's way may always be present in some considerable minority of the population. But the fact that movements employing the paranoid style are not constant, but come in successive episodic waves, suggests that the paranoid disposition is mobilized into action chiefly by social conflicts that involve ultimate schemes of values and that bring fundamental fears and hatreds rather than negotiable interests into political action. Catastrophe, or the fear of catastrophe, is most likely to elicit the syndrome of paranoid rhetoric. In American experience, ethnic and religious conflicts, with their threat of the submergence of whole systems of values, have plainly been the major focus for militant and suspicious minds of this sort. But elsewhere, class conflicts have also mobilized such energies. The paranoid tendency is aroused by a confrontation of opposed interests, which are, or are felt to be, totally irreconcilable, and thus by nature not susceptible to the normal political processes of bargain and compromise. The situation becomes worse when the representatives of a particular political interest, perhaps because of the very unrealistic and unrealizable nature of their demands, cannot make themselves felt in the political process. Feeling that they have no access to political bargaining or the making of decisions, they find their original conception of the world of power as omnipotent, sinister, and malicious fully confirmed. They see only the consequences of power, and this through distorting lenses, and have little chance to observe its actual machinery. L.B. Namier once said that the crowning achievement of historical study is to achieve an intuitive sense of how things do not happen. It is precisely this kind of awareness that the paranoid fails to develop. He has a special resistance of his own, of course, to such awareness, but circumstances often deprive him of exposure to events that might enlighten him. We are all sufferers from history, but the paranoid is a double sufferer, since he is afflicted not only by the real world with the rest of us, but by his fantasies as well. Hello, this is Fiveum, saying thank you for listening, and I sincerely hope that you enjoyed it. If you can, please like and share it around, and if you're feeling especially generous, please subscribe. I need at least 100 subscribers to change my YouTube channel's URL, and my default is long and ugly, and I really don't like it. It would be extremely helpful for me if you subscribed. But you don't have to. I'm not your boss. I'm just Fiveum. And right now, I'm signing off.